Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today's question comes to us from a viewer, thanks to Josh from Maryland for this one. Amy plays Awake in the Woods, and she has some Dryad Arbor cards that she would like to use as creature tokens. Is this allowed? Okay, so as a judge, I get variants of this sort of question all the time. People are always interested in whether they can use whatever object it is as a token. So let's talk about the specific rules and policies that are in place in a Magic tournament that would apply to this situation. First of all, I want to get one thing straight. It's a question of jurisdiction. If we're talking about a kitchen table game with just you and your friends, well, the answer is whatever you and your friends agree on. As a judge, I don't really have any authority to tell you what you can and can't do, and there's absolutely no reason what I say should keep you from doing what makes you happy. That said, at a Magic tournament, this is also a very relevant question that does come up. So let's take a little bit of time to review exactly what the rules and policy documents say in that case. And, well, I've got to say it's not a whole lot. It turns out that the answer to the question at a Magic tournament is pretty similar to the answer to the question at the kitchen table scenario that I just presented, except that it's not your friends that you have to talk to, it's the judge. If the head judge says that you can use it as a token, then it's okay, simple as that. However, that doesn't just mean you can go out and do whatever you want. There certainly are considerations for what would or would not be allowed, so let's take a little bit of time and talk about what those would be. Basically, it boils down to the head judge can and should disallow the use of any token that might be considered disruptive to the event. So let's take a look at some different categories of tokens or things that people have tried to use as tokens that come up the most often, at least from my experience. And the first one that I would say would be things that are disruptive to the game itself. So for example, you probably know this, but almost every Magic tournament, space is at a premium. And if your tokens are oversized, that is substantially larger than what a normal Magic card would be, well, it's pretty likely that they're using up more than is appropriate of your limited play space. And so that would be one example of a token that would be disruptive to the game. Another would be things like Lego minifigs or coins, which is something that I pretty heavily discourage. And the reason for that is because it's generally pretty difficult to tell whether they're tapped or untapped at a glance. And so again, that would make it a little bit harder to play the game of Magic. Another form of disruption would be if the token has some form of inappropriate text or imagery printed on it. I think a lot of people have probably encountered these, either seeing them or hearing about them in some form, and it's a pretty big topic to know exactly where the line should be drawn, probably deserving of its own episode. But for now, I'll just say that if the head judge sees something objectionable, they're probably not going to let you use the token. And finally, that brings us to the last category of tokens that are disruptive to the game or the tournament, and that would be ones that are too similar to an actual Magic card. And this is of course the one that's going to be probably the most relevant to the situation that was presented in the original problem statement. So let's go ahead and unpack exactly what this would mean. One thing that you sometimes see players do is use cards from their sideboard face down to represent creature tokens. This practice is almost universally discouraged by judges, and it's for a very simple reason. It's just way too simple for something to happen in the course of the game where those tokens would go to the player's graveyard or even somewhere in their library or their hand. And of course, if this situation were to happen, it's very difficult and disruptive to the game if you needed to fix it. And that's the reason why judges don't like to see this sort of thing. There might not be a specific rule that says you can't do that, but at the same time, there is a lot of other rules that kind of imply that it's not a good idea. This is the same reason why judges don't like to see people using cards as tokens, just regular Magic cards. And it's because it's way too easy for them to get confused with the rest of your deck. And so that would be the real concern that I, or probably most other judges, would have about doing something like what was listed in the original problem statement, where you tried to use Dryad Arbors as the tokens for Awake in the Woods. And even here, there's a little bit of gray area or a little bit of room to work. So again, even though there isn't any specific rule against doing this, there certainly are some other rules that might come into play that you would definitely want to be aware of. So for example, let's take a look at this rule here from the IPG. If you were playing at competitive rules enforcement level, you would have to be aware that cards that are stored with your sideboard might be considered to be part of your sideboard. And of course, that wouldn't match with what the sideboard that you turned in on your deck list at the beginning of the day would say. And so you might run into a problem where you would get a deck problem if you had these Dryad Arbors in your deck box with the rest of your sideboard. Now, there are a couple of things that you can do to help prevent this from happening. The first of them would be to not store them with your sideboard. If you have another deck box or somewhere else that you could put them, that would be great. Finally, depending on what format you're playing, that might take care of the issue too. So for example, if you wanted to do this in Pioneer, where Dryad Arbor is not legal, then I would probably not have too big of an issue if you wanted to use those Pioneer non-legal cards as tokens for your Pioneer legal cards. On the other hand, if you were doing this in Modern, where both Dryad Arbor and Awaken the Woods are legal, well, it might be a little bit more complicated of an issue, especially if your deck was actually playing the actual card Dryad Arbor. Finally, another issue that might come up is that the tokens might in some way confuse the game state. So taking for example the Dryad Arbor one, if you notice the tokens from Awaken the Woods are not actually named Dryad Arbor. So if someone were to play, for example, a Bile Blight against the actual Dryad Arbor, then that would not take out any of the tokens from Awaken the Woods, even though it might look and seem to the player as though that would be the case based on the tokens that you were using. It's not legal for you to gain some sort of an advantage from an ambiguity that you created in the game, so this sort of situation that could come up is another reason why judges might ask you to leave the Dryad Arbor cards on the bench and find something else to use as a token. And that's all of the different things that I could think of that might cause a judge to say you could or could not use a specific object as a token in an actual Magic tournament. Unfortunately, there isn't any specific rule or passage in Magic's rules or policy documents that say you can use this sort of object or you can't use that sort of object as a token. So it's basically just down to 100% the head judge's discretion. But those are the sorts of issues that the head judge would probably be thinking about. But that's all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another daily ruling. But until then, I hope you have a great day.